Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kufay. We're going to go back and start the Mishna that we learned at the very end of yesterday's daf, and we will actually finish and end just before the next Mishna. So our case is, which makes our daf a very contained daf. Mida b'chevel ani mocher lecha, hen chaser, hen yatel. And we're going to, if you might remember that we've had this kind of discussion before, and we're going to review a whole bunch of sugyot that we've already seen. So if somebody says contradictory language, on the one hand, they say, Mida b'chevel, I'm selling you an exact measured piece of land, which would mean, remember, if there's some discrepancy, any kind of discrepancy goes back to whoever it belongs to, but then added the words, hen chaser, hen yetel, which was like saying more or less. So if you say more or less, then there is some amount that we assume if you give too much or you give too little, so the other side is fine with that, and we just leave it as is. Bitel, the Mishnah rules, bitel hein chaser hein yatil mida b'chevel. The second language the person used cancels out the first. And the Rashbam adds, and thank you for Becky for asking this after class yesterday, which is this is only if chazar bo toch kedei dibur. This is only if this happens immediately after. Okay, if immediately after, meaning these words all happened very, very quickly, one right after the other. If that's the case, then we view this as if the second language was meant to cancel out the first. It's like, you change your mind. You start saying something and then you quickly change your mind. And likewise, hein chaser hein yeter mida b'chevel, bitel mida b'chevel, hein chaser hein yeter. Divrei ben nanas. This is all ben nanas' opinion. The Mishnah tells us they don't mention that there's another opinion. Seems obvious there's another opinion. Why the Mishnah didn't mention is a good question. And we'll sort of address it a little bit as we go on. But basically, we end up with this big machloket, which we don't know yet there's a machloket, but that's going to be the point of the Gemara to point out, well, what do the rabbis or those who disagree with Ben Nanas hold? But according to Ben Nanas, and we call this in the language of later, comes up another sugyot, tvos lashon acharon. We go by the last thing the person said because we assume that the person was just correcting what they said originally. They started saying one thing and then, oh no, I didn't really mean that. I meant something else. We're now going to deal, today's sugya is all going to be about Rav and Shmuel. And we're going to start with Rav, then we're going to move to Shmuel. And there's going to be some lack of, it's not exactly parallel what we're going to do with each one, and I'll point out the differences. Amar Rabbi Abba bar Mamal Amar Rav. So Rabbi Abba bar Mamal passes now in the name of Rav. The rabbis disagree, or friends of Ben Nanas disagree with him, meaning there's another opinion, which was kind of obvious from the Mishnah itself, although the Mishnah didn't say what it was. And the question is going to be, what does the other opinion hold? So first the Gemara says, okay, we don't yet know what Rav thinks the rabbis hold, but now the Gemara is going to say, why did Rabbi Abba bar Mamal need to tell us this? Isn't it obvious to us that there's another opinion from a Mishnah? A Mishnah in Bava Mitzia that we learned. My kamashmala. Why is Rav Abba bar Mamal telling us in the name of Rav that Ben Nanas' friends disagree with him when we know that Ben Nanas' friends disagree because we assume you know this Mishnah? Tanina ma'aseh b'tzipori be'echad shesachar merchatz mechavero b'shneim-asar zuvim l'shana dinar zahav l'chodesh. There was a case that happened in Tzipori. There was a person who rented a bathhouse from someone else. And the rental agreement was 12 zehuvim, 12 gold dinarim for the year. Dinar zahav lechodesh, 1 dinar per month. Now the question here, there's a few issues, right? One is the rent for the whole year? What happened? Now you have to remember, nowadays we know in advance when there's going to be a leap year. But in those days, they didn't know because we get to Adar and they would decide, do we need to add a second Adar or not? So when you stand at the beginning of the year and you say it's 12 zuvim for the year, dinar per month, well, the question is, did you mean that it's for 12 months or did you mean that it's for a year, whether there's a 13th month or not, which has all sorts of ramifications, right? First of all, is it 12 for the whole year? Do you have to pay the extra rent for the month? Can the landlord kick you out after the 12th month? Or can you say no? Like this agreement was for the year. So if you say, right, a dinar zahav lechodesh, that also means that each month is kind of an independent unit. And when that month is over, the landlord can say, hey, listen, I don't really want you in there anymore. So that's really a big question. Which one did you mean? So Bama said lifnei Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel v'lifnei Rabbi Yosi. Now, if you're ben Nanas, what would you say? We go by Lashon Hacharon. It's a rental agreement per month, really. Each month is considered an independent unit. They can change their mind at the end of the month. Okay, if there's a 13th month, right, then it could be, you could kick them out that last month. So now the question is, right, is it really like one rental agreement for the entire year, which ends at the end of the year? So if you're Ben Nanas, you're going to say it's by month, and then again, right, presumably the issue really is that 13th month. Would you be able to kick the person out at the end of that 13th month? But what had happened with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Yosi? So the case came in front of them. They say they split it 50-50. Okay? So now, Yachloku, which means, right, so the Rashbam says, Yitain lo sachar chodesh, de mamona mutal b'safek chokim, de misaf galu, itvos lashon rishon, it lashon acharon. What do the rabbis hold? And it's exactly sumchus, okay? And Becky, you also mentioned this at the end of class yesterday, which is, sumchus says, if we have money that we're not sure what to do with, right? Was it 12 zuvim for the year? Was it one per month, which would mean you have to pay 13, right? Can you kick him out? Can you not? So, right, at the end of that month, or right, at the end of the 12 months. So basically we say we split it 50-50. Okay, we say you pay for half a month since we're not sure whether you need to pay or not, because we're not sure, do we go by 12 zuvim for the year or do we go by dinar lechodesh? So basically where Ben Nanas holds that it's clear that the second language was canceling out the first, so there's no suffix here at all. There's no case of doubt. The rabbis, according to Rav, disagree and think this is a case of doubt. And the question is, now you might remember, there's a machloket sumchus and the rabbis. What do you do in a case of doubt? Do you do split 50-50, or do you say hamotzi mechaver alav haraya, right? The one who's in possession has the right of way, basically has the upper hand, and whoever wants to take money out of them, the burden of proof is on them. That's not what Rav says. Rav says, or it's not what Rav doesn't exactly say this. The Mishna says it. Is that Rashban and Rabbi Yosi hold yachloku, split it 50-50, sumchus, because it's a doubt. So now let's just go back, because we're in the middle of a question, actually. You might not have remembered. But we started out with the Rav Abba Bar Mamal said that the rabbis disagree with Ben Nanas, to which the Gemara said, why do you have to tell us this? It's obvious from this Mishna in Bava Metzia that people disagree with Ben Nanas, because if we went by Tfos Lashon Acharon, it would be, for sure, you would have to pay dinar zahav lechodesh. It would be this monthly arrangement, right? And the 13th month, if you were going to stay, you would have to pay the full rent for that 13th month. And if also the landlord wanted to kick out the renter for that last month, they could, because it was all an agreement by the month and not for a complete year. So now the Gemara says, well, why? So why did Rav or Rav Abba Bar Mamal need to tell us in the name of Rav that the friends of Sumchus, I keep confusing Ben Nanas and Sumchus, the friends of Ben Nanas disagree? Ime hatam hava amina. If we just had the Mishnah in Bava Metzia, I would have thought hatam hu di'ika l'meimar mehadar kar hadarbe v'ika l'meimar perusha kamafarish. There's two possibilities in the case of the Mishnah, and this is the doubt in the Mishnah. It's not the same as us. In the case of the Mishnah, it's not clear whether the second statement of dinar zahav lechodesh was meant to contradict and change, right, do a shift like midah b'chevel hin chaser hin yeter, like our Mishnah, or it could be that it was just perushe kamefarish. It was coming to define. When I said 12 zehuvim for a year, I meant 1 dinar for each month. And maybe it was just explaining. Now, if you say, right, they changed their mind, then, right, or you say, we're not sure whether they changed their mind or they defined it, then we're left with this doubt. And that's why we have a doubt, because this language could be canceling out. It could be just explaining. Aval hacha, but in our case, divadai kahadarbe imalo. But in our case, midah b'chevel and hein chaser hein yatil cannot coexist. Those are two contradictory things. They're mutually exclusive. Whereas shnei masar zuvim l'shana and dinar zahav l'chodesh are not mutually exclusive. They're not contradictory. One could be defining the other. When I said a year, I meant, right, 12 for a year. I meant if it was a 12-month year. But if not, right, dinar zahav l'chodesh, or right, or it could be, or it could be understood differently. Okay, so now if you look in the Rashbam, he explains it some of the sides a little better. In the middle of the Rashbam, Dibor Matzchili Mehatam, or toward the end of that one, Havamina says, Gam, let me just see where to start. Elami dinar zahav l'chodesh u'maskira, kadeshi yitol dinar b'chol chodesh, right? So maybe when he said dinar zahav, he meant 1 dinar for each month. The gam im yirtze lachzor bo milahaskira l'sof chodesh, o l'sof shnei chodeshim, yuchal lahotzio mibeito ve'eno chayav lamid lo bayit acher. And therefore, you could say, right, that maybe it was to say, I'm not renting this to you for the whole year. I'm really renting it to you by month. And then that would be a different explanation. Or it could be, right, so basically we're going to say, here we're not sure which one he meant, whether it was to explain, and then they work together. It doesn't cancel out the first, or the second one cancels the first. Then we just don't know, and therefore that's why we're going to say yachloku in that case. However, if you say, in our case, where the two contradict each other, then you might not have thought that the rabbis disagreed. Maybe when they contradict, it's clear that the second language is coming to change the first. And that's all based on laws of toch kedei dibur, that when you change, you say something right away, you can really change what you mean. And maybe he'd say Tfos Lashon Achron, Kamash Malan. That's why Rav has to come and say, Chokim alav chaverav ben nanas. Also in the Mishnah, they disagree in our Mishnah. So basically what this is saying is, not that they're any different. They're not different in the end. But you might have thought that they're different. You might have thought that in the case of the rent, where they don't actually contradict, they could work together. They could contradict, they could work together. Maybe that case, they would say, Yachloku, you split it. But in our case, where it's clear that one is different than the other, maybe not. No, in the end, actually, according to Rav, and this is the important conclusion we're coming to, according to Rav, Ben Nanas' friends disagree. And how do they disagree? They say Yachloku. Split it 50-50. So that means if, let's say, I bought this lamb from you and you said, midah b'chevel, hein chaser, hein yeter. If there's extra, let's say I got too much. So according to Ben Nanas, we say hein chaser, hein yeter. As long as it's under 7.5 kav, I get to keep it. If we go by the, again, Rav's explanation, and this is going to be important because Shmuel's going to disagree with it, Rav explanation of those who disagree with Ben Nanas, we're going to say we split it 50-50. So I have to give back half. Okay, I would give back half of the, let's say it was 7.5, I would give back half of that, 3.75, and I would keep 3.75 kav of that amount, of that land. But now we're going to move to Shmuel. Now I want you to notice a few things we did in Rav. One is we pointed out that the rabbis disagreed. We explained what is the rabbi's position based on sumchus, yachloku, and that's really based on the Mishnah about the chodesh ha'ibur, which is that's a yachloku, mamonu mutab safek chokim. We don't know what to do with this money, so we split it 50-50. And that's Rav. Now, Rav doesn't paskin here, if you notice. Rav just points out that friends of Ben Nanas disagree with him. That's all Rav does. Okay, points it out. We question it. Why does he need to point this out? Isn't it obvious? And then we say, it wasn't so obvious from there. That's why you need to point it out. But in the end, it is obvious. Okay, now we know the Mishnah there is just like here, and it's all a din of we don't know what to do with the money. We're not sure. Again, Ben Nanas is very sure. The second thing you said canceled out the first. Rav is saying that the people who disagree with Ben Nanas, sorry, I keep confusing their names. People who disagree with Ben Nanas are basically saying, we don't know what to do. And then when we don't know what to do, we employ the rules of when you don't know what to do with money, what do? You split it 50-50. But we don't know what Rav holds. We're going to have to wait till the end of the daf to find that out. Comes Shmuel. I'm a Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda quotes Shmuel, who says very similar to Rav with a minor difference, more in the language he uses. And then we're going to see also majorly in what he thinks the rabbis hold. But he also basically points out that the rabbis disagree with Ben Nanas, and he says, Zo divrei Ben Nanas, what you read in our Mishnah, well, that's just Ben Nanas. Now, we knew that because the Mishnah said it was Ben Nanas, but he's pointing out what seemed to be obvious, which is, Aval chachamim omrim, but the rabbis say, halach achal pachot shebalishonot. Now, this is not yachloku, okay? What does it mean, halach achar pachot shebalishonot? Unclear. You go by the least of the languages. Okay, that's not so clear. Right? When you have two different languages, two things that contradict, you go by the least. Different explanations, but we're going to go with the Rashbam, who basically explains what, if you're going to disagree with Rav, what are you going to say? Well, remember, either you go with Sumchus, who says, we split a 50-50, or you go with the rabbis who say, which means the burden of proof rests on the one who's not in possession, who wants to get something that's not theirs. So now you have to figure out in our case of the midah b'chevel, hen chaser, hen yeter, who's the one in possession, who's not. So the Rashbam explains that the buyer is the one who's trying to get something from the seller, because the land belonged to the seller in the first place, and the seller basically said, this is what I'm giving you, midah b'chevel, hen chaser, hen yeter. And since we're not sure, or the reverse, we're not sure which language really they meant, and perhaps they were leaving all their options open to basically give them the upper hand. And therefore, since we're not sure, we leave things where they are. Okay, so what does that mean? So what that means is, right, whatever makes the buyer get less. Okay, so therefore, let's go with it. If the buyer got more land, well, again, right, let's say when they measured it out, they gave the buyer too much land. Since the seller was originally the one who had the land, or some people say it's also because they already got the money for the land, then if they gave too much, we're going to go by midah b'chevel, and the seller's going to get it back. If they didn't give enough land, but it's within the margin of error that we talked about of the 7.5 kav, then again, the seller has the upper hand and doesn't have to give any more. Then we'll say, oh, that was the hen chaser, hen yet. So again, it's an issue of safek here. The rabbis view this as we're not sure, where again, Ben Nana says it's very clear. What you said at the end was what you meant. Comes Shmuel and says, the rabbis say it's unclear, but in the case it's unclear, they rule differently than Rav said, which is we say we're going to leave the money, we're going to leave everything where it is, and we're going to basically give the upper hand to the seller in our case. And it would be whatever the different cases are, right? It would be whoever's muchzak, whoever has the possession of the item, they're the ones who have the upper hand. So there's two main differences here in what Shmuel said. One is what he thinks Chachamim say. The people who disagree with Ben Nanas, according to Rav, they thought the people who disagree with Ben Nanas say we split 50-50. According to Shmuel, the person who's muchzak, who in possession, has the upper hand. The person who's trying to get something from the other is the weaker one, right? And the burden of proof is on them. The second thing is the language he used. If you look at the language, Rav just said, Ben Nanas' friends disagree. Shmuel said, this is what Ben Nanas said, but, which is a big word here, but the rabbis disagree. So the Gemara says, because he says, this is divrei Ben Nanas zo, okay, sounds like v'lo sfira. If you had to say who does Shmuel hold like, you would assume when Shmuel says, well, this is Ben Nanas, but the rabbis disagree, chances are, right, what Shmuel's trying to tell you is, especially because he's saying, and the majority of the people disagree, that Shmuel's holding like the rabbis. Whereas Rav's language just pointed out to you, by the way, people disagree with Ben Nanas. That's not it's not clear that Rav is paskening like those people. But in the language of Shmuel, it sounds like Shmuel is holding like the rabbis. And what we're going to do now is bring a bunch of other cases, which we've actually seen in the past, or bring one case that we saw today and one case that we saw in a different sugya in Bava Batra, where we're going to try to figure out is it true that Shmuel really holds like the rabbis over Ben Nanas? Or maybe it seems like Shmuel holds like Ben Nanas, and we're going to try to figure out, and then we're going to distinguish between the cases and say, well, this is not exactly like that, and try to compare these cases to say, are these the same or are these not the same? So right now, the Gemara assumes that from the language of Shmuel, we can assume, and now we're moving into a different territory. First was, do they disagree? And if they disagree, how do they disagree? And we had two opinions about how they disagree. Everyone agrees they disagree. It's just a matter of how. The second thing is to figure out how do they hold. So right now we're going to deal with how does Shmuel hold it, who we infer it from his words, which we think it means he holds like the rabbis, which we're going to raise a question. Could he really hold like the rabbis? Because look, Rav Shmuel, the Amrei Travai, Rav and Shmuel both said, Kor b'shloshim ani mocher lecha, yachol lachzor bo afilu b'se'ah achrona. If you sell me a kor, which is 30 se'ah, for 30 sla'im, and you say, I'm selling you 30 kor for 30 sla'im, just like the rental thing was one whole agreement of the entire year is one unit, if we say just that. Here, the whole sale is one sale, which means what? If the seller, and you're measuring out all those seot, so as you measure each one and you keep going, we can change our mind at any point. They're not mine until the last one is measured, because this is one complete deal for the whole amount. But if the seller says, kor b'shloshim se'ah b'sela, right? A kor, 30 se'ah for 30 sla'im, but each se'ah is for a sela, which basically means that each se'ah is going to be independent. Each one, every sale of each se'ah is for one sela. Ani mocher lecha, rishon kana. As we measure out each se'ah, the deal is, right, that the deal on that se'ah is closed. So as we finish the first se'ah, it's mine. No one can change their mind about it. It's already mine. And when we measure the second se'ah, it's mine. And we can't change our mind. Now, 30, right, kor b'shloshim, a kor for 30 for 30, and which means it's one whole deal. Se'ah b'sela means each se'ah is an individual deal. Those two things contradict each other. And what does Shmuel and Rav hold? Right, Rav doesn't really interest us right now because we have no idea what Rav holds here. But in this case, right, we know what Shmuel holds, or we think we know what Shmuel holds. We think that Shmuel's holding by the rabbis. But the rabbis would say, we're not sure which language you meant when you say contradictory things. We're not sure. We should split it 50-50, or right, come up with some sort of, Shmuel says, hamotzi mechaver alav haraya, right? The burden of proof is on the person who's not muchzak. So we shouldn't say, right, we're not sure which language. It's not clear. And what does it say here? Rishon kana. It's very clear. We go by Lashon HaCharon. So it sounds like, because the Lashon HaCharon is se'ah b'sela, as if each one is an individual deal, and that seems to be the ruling. So the Gemara says, so again, Shmuel seems to hold by the rabbis from the language he uses. This is Ben Nanas, but the rabbis hold, sounding like what we hold like the rabbis, which says, hamotzi mechaver alav haraya. But in the case where we have a contradiction, he seems clearly to go, in some other case, he seems clearly to go by Tfos Lashon Acharon. We view the se'ah b'sela as the thing that determines the halacha here against the kor b'shloshim. To which the Gemara says, Ela zo usfirale. So it must be, based on this case of the kor b'shloshim se'ah b'sela, that he actually holds like Ben Nanas, Tfos Lashon Acharon. So now we shift entirely what we thought. We thought that language meant Shmuel disagrees with Ben Nanas and rules like the rabbis, but it turns out he doesn't. However, the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute. We're going to bring another problem, though, with the conclusion we just now said. Umi sfirale, does Shmuel really hold like Ben Nanas? No, he doesn't. How do we know that? Because now we'll go back to the merchatz case. Before we read it inside, let's just think about the merchatz. The beit merchatz is the bathhouse that somebody rented. He said 12 zehuvim l'shana, dinar zahav l'chodesh. Now, if you say tfos l'shon acharon, dinar zahav l'chodesh, then the seller is going to have to, right, we're going to have to make the renter pay for that last month another dinar, basically, right? That's obvious. But, so what does Shmuel say in that case? Amar Shmuel, biba be'emtza hachodesh askina. Shmuel says that Mishna, where we rule basically that Rabban Shimon, Gamliel and Rabbi Yosi said Yachloku et Chodesh Ha'ibur, he says Yachloku et Chodesh Ha'ibur only if it's in the middle of the month. That's when we split it 50-50. Aval ba b'tchilat hachodesh kulo lamaskil, b'sof hachodesh kulo lasocher. If we're standing in the beginning of the month and the renter hasn't used it for the 13th month yet, well, then the rights go to the maskir. The maskir can do whatever the maskir wants because theoretically, the property right now belongs to the owner. So the owner gets to decide, right? Maybe I don't want to rent it to you, and if I do, you have to pay me an extra month's rent. And he has all the rights because he's the one in possession. If it's the end of the month and the renter has already used it for that entire month, and then the landlord owner comes and says, hey, you owe me for this month. What do you mean? Who's in possession? Well, the one who's in possession is the renter, because the renter already used it. It's already been used by the renter. And then the burden, right? And then basically the other side's going to have to prove, and they can't prove it, so they don't win. So now let's just be very clear about this. If you hold like bananas, what are you going to say? Tfos lashon acharon. It's dinar zahav lechodesh. And whether it's middle of the month, end of the month, beginning of the month, it doesn't matter. For sure, we're going to go by the second language, which is it was a monthly arrangement. And therefore, right, if let's say they use the space, they definitely have to pay, right? It's going to be clear, and it's not going to be based on beginning of the month, end of the month, right? We're clearly going to follow Lashon Acharon. So if Shmuel really held like bananas, Shmuel wouldn't have said this. So basically, we're stuck. So turning now to Amud Bet, we're now going to say, okay, so it can't possibly be that Shmuel holds like bananas. Really, Shmuel says, this is bananas, but the rabbis say, and what he really meant is, but I hold like the rabbis. Now, what was the problem? The problem is, how do you explain the Kor b'shloshim se'ah b'sela? Why, in that case, did it sound like he was going by Lashon Acharon, se'ah b'sela, and every se'ah that's measured, that's a done deal, even though shloshim b'se'ah wouldn't, Kor b'shloshim wouldn't indicate that way. So they say, no, that's for a different reason. Now, remember what Shmuel says the rabbis hold. The rabbis hold it's all about chazaka. And that made perfect sense with what he said about the merchatz. In the middle of the month, half of it was already used by the renter, and half of it is up to the landlord. It's because no one's used it yet. It really belongs to the landlord. Beginning of the month, it's all the landlords. End of the month, it's already been used. And that all goes by chazaka, which matches perfectly the rabbis. And we're even going to explain the Kor b'shloshim se'ah b'sela to be like the rabbis. Why is that? Because it's all about hatam tamamai. What's the case in the case of the merchatz? Mishum ditafis, because it all goes by who's in possession. Hachanami hatafis. We're going to explain Kor b'shloshim se'ah b'sela, not because we follow Lashon Acharon, but why do we say that the buyer acquires each se'ah as it gets measured? Because as soon as you measure it, it's as if the buyer is in possession of it. So because it was measured for the buyer, it's as if the buyer is in possession of it, and it's as if the buyer, is holding it, and it's in their property. And then if the seller wants to get it back, the burden of proof is on them, which basically means they're not going to be able to get it back, and there's no reneging on the deal. Because again, everything now, the way we've explained it, can follow the position of the rabbis that we're not sure really what you meant, but we go by whoever's in possession. And that's the general rule. So what we did in this section was, we did the same thing with Rav, which is, we pointed out that according to Shmuel says clearly that the rabbis disagree with bananas, but we start asking, the second thing. So the first thing we pointed out was, how do the rabbis disagree with bananas? He has a different approach. He goes by the rabbi's position of Hamotzi Mechaber Alav Haraya rather than Sumchus. Rav thinks that the rabbis who disagree follow Sumchus's position. 50-50. And that was based on the merchatz, because they split a 50-50. Shmuel explained the splitting of the 50-50 of the merchatz is all based on laws of chazaka, who's muchzak, right? And that it's only, remember, he says the merchatz is only if it's in the middle of the month. where each one is in possession of 50% of the month. And that's how he fits it in with his position. And then we tried to say, well, does Shmuel actually hold like the rabbis, which we thought at first, then said, no, that doesn't seem to match this other case. And then we said, actually, it does seem to, right? And then in the end, we conclude he holds like the rabbis, and we reconciled all the cases to basically fit in with Shmuel's position of the rabbis, that it's all based on the burden of proof is on the one who wants to take something away from the other. And that now fits across the board. Now we're going to go back to Rav, because we didn't see about Rav. All Rav pointed out was that the rabbis disagree with Simchos, or there are rabbis who rabbis disagree with bananas. There are rabbis who disagree with bananas. Then we just asked this question, why does he need to tell us this? It's clear from this other Mishna. And then we said, well, that other Mishna could be understood differently, and therefore there was a need to say it. Now we're going to try to see what Rav holds, or we're going to see what Rav holds. Amar Rav Huna, Amre Bei Rav. So Rav Huna said that in the house of Rav, they ruled the following way, in a different case, but the same kind of thing. Istira me'amai. Okay, first you need to know what an istira, and you need to know what me'amai is. Me'amai is 100 copper coins. Istira are 96 copper coins. It's a half of a dinar. A dinar has 192 copper coins in it, and an istira has half of that. An istira has 96 copper coins. So if we're making a deal and I'm selling you something, and I say I'm selling it to you for an istira for 100 mea. So I'm basically I'm basically saying to you, I'm selling it to you for 96 coins. I'm selling it to you for 100 coins. Okay, that obviously contradicts. I'm either selling it to you for 96 or I'm selling it to you for 100. So again, we're going to have the same question here. Is it a doubt? And do we do 98? Is it a doubt? And the burden of proof is on the person who needs to pay, right? The burden of proof is on the one who wants to get the money. Do we say, right, Tfos Lashon Acharon, which would be we go by the last thing you said, and that would be bananas? Well, in fact, Rav Huna is going to say that Rav Patzkin's like bananas, because Istra me'amai, if that's what the person said, I'm selling this to you for 96 for 100 coins, me'amai, you have to pay 100 coins. If you say me'amai istira, if you say I'm selling it to you for 100 coins for 96 coins, istira, you pay 96. That is very clear that we hold by the Lashon Acharon, and that's bananas. So Rav actually holds like bananas. So now the Gemara is going to ask the same type of question we asked on Rav in the beginning, which is, or on Rav Huna, right? In the beginning, we asked on Rav Bar Mama who quoted Rav. Now we're going to ask it on Rav Huna. My kamashmalan, Tfos Lashon Acharon. What you're trying to teach us that Rav holds Tfos Lashon Acharon like bananas, and the reason why we're going to ask this question is Ha'amarav Chadazina. Rav already said this somewhere else, because where did Rav say this? Well, on the Merchatz case. Now remember the Merchatz case. What happened in the Merchatz case in the bathhouse? There was a debate, right? Which lashon, and in the end, we said that Rashbag and Rabbi Yosi didn't agree with bananas. They didn't say we go by the last thing you said. They said we're unsure, and therefore we're going to say yachloku. The money that they're disagreeing about, we're going to split 50-50. Well, Rav's response to that Mishnah was the following. Rav said, if I was there, I would have given everything to the maskir, to the renter. To the one who's renting it out, to the landlord. The owner of the property would have gotten everything. In other words, they would have had the right of way. Okay? And then that goes by Tzfos Lashon Acharon, dinar zahav lechodesh, right? They get to decide. Maybe I don't want to rent it to you for that extra month. Or if I do, I'm charging you an extra month, right? All the powers in the hand of the one who's renting it out, in the hands of the landlord. So what do you see? That's because Tzfos Lashon Acharon, and that is like bananas. So basically the question is not, how could Rav hold like bananas? That actually doesn't bother them. It's fine that Rav held like bananas. The question is just, why did Rav Huna need to point it out in this Istra Me'amai case, when it would have been obvious already from something else Rav had said about the Mishnah, about the bathhouse? To which the next about 10-15 words are all in parentheses, so I'm skipping them. That means they shouldn't really be here in the text. To which the Gemara answers, end of our sugya, Mao detema perusha kamefaresh kamash malan. If you remember, we suggested there before that maybe the reason, it's not because of Tfos Lashon Acharon. The reason we basically go by the side of the maskir here is because Perushe Kamefarish, because maybe here, that was exactly what we suggested, maybe the last words, they don't actually contradict the first words, because again, the first words were just said in a basic case where there is no leap year and there's no expectation of a leap year. Maybe then the person said, oh, well, in case there's a leap year, let me just spell it out. And it was just spelling out the first part. And then we would say the following. If Rav Paskin, that in that case, we go by the last thing you said, that might be for a different reason. Because maybe Rav understood that case, since they're not contradictory, the first statement and the last could work together, then maybe there, the reason he goes by the last words is only because they could be viewed as explaining. But when they actually contradict, like in our Mishnah, midah b'chevel, hein chaser hein yeter, which are two mutually exclusive statements, they can't work together, maybe Rav wouldn't hold that way. And that's why, or in Istara Me'amai, where they actually contradict, that's why Rav Huna wanted you to know, no. It's not, Rav didn't hold that way in the Merchatz against Rashbag and Rabbi Yosi, because he held that case was unique because it was really explaining. No, he held that way because he held like Benanas, and that's what Rav Huna is pointing out, this Istra Me'amai. Really, he holds like Benanas across the board. And with that, we finished our section. So let's just review. We started with this Mishnah, which is basically only bringing Benanas' position. What we did in the Gemara were two things, basically. We had Rav and Shmuel, who each told us that the rabbis disagree with Benanas. However, each one had a different approach about what the rabbis who disagree say. Rav said that the rabbis who disagree basically hold Yachloku based on Sumchus. And this brought us all the way back to the basic Bava Metzia sugya about what we do with money that we're not sure what to do with. Either which way we think the rabbis think, the ones who disagree with Benanas, that it's an issue of we're not sure what you meant, whereas Benanas is very sure. I know you meant, I'm correcting myself, and we only go by the last thing you said. The other two approaches are to say, no, we're not sure. The question is, what do we do when we're not sure? Do we go with Sumchus, which Rav says? The rabbis say, we're going to go 50-50. In other words, these two rabbis, Rashbag and Rabbi Yosi, must be holding by Sumchus, whereas Shmuel holds that the rabbis who disagree with Benanas are actually holding Hamotzi Mechaber Alav Haraya. The one who is in possession has the upper hand. The other one, the burden of proof is on them. And then that was part one. Part two was what did Rav and Shmuel themselves hold? And we in the end proved, even though we had a back and forth about it, Shmuel holds like the rabbis and Rav holds like Benanas. And we just had to figure out with Rav, with Shmuel, it was just more confusing. Who does he hold by? And we brought different cases. In the end, we kind of explained them all to be consistent with the burden of proof rests upon the claimant. And with Rav, we just had the question of, well, why do you need to tell us that? Isn't it obvious from this other case? And then we said, well, it wasn't so obvious from the other case because Rav's reaction to the rabbis in the Beit HaMerchatz could be specific to the Beit HaMerchatz case where they're not actually, they're not definitely contradicting each other. Whereas in cases where the two languages definitely contradict each other, maybe Rav wouldn't hold that way. But in the end, Rav Huna is pointing out he does hold that way. He holds Fas Lashon Achron like Benanas. With that, we finish our daf. We will start a new Mishnah tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good and a quiet day.